thank you for your interest in this topic. Certainly a very controversial topic, and one which I hope I can shed some light on. I've taken some liberties with this title in as much that given the interest that has occurred, particularly in the past few weeks, I'm emphasizing issues that relate to vaping in our discussion this morning, because I think in some ways they're probably of more contemporary interest. It is important that I share with you the kind of relationships that I have had in the past, and important that you assess for yourself the objectivity as a consequence that I bring to our discussion this morning. Of all of the things that we can do outside of childhood vaccination in any clinical setting, the most substantial and significant preventive intervention that we can deliver, both from the point of view of primary and secondary prevention, is smoking cessation. And probably nowhere there is that as true as it is in the case of the management of cardiovascular disease. We also know that smokers in North America will lose at least a decade of life expectancy, which is a staggering loss of life, and just makes it even more ironic that tobacco products of any kind are the only consumer product that do not have any meaningful form of regulation. I graduated from medical school at some remote point in the last century, and at the time, not some years after the arrival of the Surgeon General's report, the Royal College of Physicians report in the UK, and I said to myself, this is not going to be an issue, because insightful public officials, politicians, will ensure that these products are regulated and we will not face the carnage that might be anticipated to occur. Unfortunately, my naivety is matched only by the reptilian stealth of the tobacco industry and the timidity of public officials who do not have the courage to develop and introduce effective and innovative public health regulation. Just by way of example, this year we will see in Canada for the first time plain packaging of cigarette products. This was a concept that was developed in Canada, was first introduced in Canada, and we are 10 years after many other countries copied that initiative and that concept, and in fact introduced plain packaging. So 35 years, after the introduction of a concept, we finally get the innovation, and it's a measure of just how slow and how tedious it can be to get effective regulation of tobacco products. Well, if e-cigarettes are of contemporary issue, so are zombies. And so I thought this morning, and perhaps some of you have heard me make these metaphors before, we talked just briefly about some of the zombies, of smoking cessation. Misconceptions that just don't die off, and unfortunately are often expressed by senior clinicians and others, reflecting a degree of naivete, misconception, dogma, prejudice in terms of approaches to dealing with tobacco addiction. And one of those is that smoking is a habit, and I would ask all of you to commit today never, ever, ever again in any sentence in which the word smoking appears to use the word habit, because that just reveals immediately you do not understand the fundamental elements that impel and maintain smoking behavior. Nicotine is the most addictive drug that we have in the community. And if you look at this data from a classic textbook of psychopharmacology, you see that the likelihood of becoming addicted to nicotine following only one exposure is the greatest for this drug than it is for all of the other substances which cause so much damage in our community. And of course, this is relevant in the context of discussing e-cigarettes, because as we will see in a moment, these devices deliver prodigious quantities of nicotine as rapidly and in a very, if I may even use the word, sophisticated way as possible. So a few years ago, I would have said that outside of the implantable insulin pump, this is the most sophisticated drug delivery device in the community. And most clinicians give no thought whatsoever, for perhaps understandable reasons, about the precepts and the principles that underlie the design of this device so that it delivers a precise aliquot of nicotine as rapidly and in a way which is misperceived as pleasurably as possible. And we could spend the rest of the day talking about some of the elements of cigarette design. The filter, for instance, does absolutely diddly squat nothing. Intriguing that many of the cigarette filters contain a colorimetric substance which, when heated, turns yellow-brown. So that smokers look at their filter and say, my goodness, look at the crud that has been extracted from the cigarette smoke by this filter. Nothing of the sort is occurring. The first cigarette filters were made of asbestos. There was a very inspired kind of decision. We also get very excited about intravenous drug users, while, unless we think about it for a moment, fail to recognize that smokers are intra-arterial drug users. Because the moment you inhale cigarette smoke, it's delivered very, very rapidly to the left ventricle via the pulmonary circulation, and then immediately you get massive distribution of the products of smoking, all of those chemicals, to every tissue, every organ system of the body. And nicotine is delivered particularly rapidly to areas of the brainstem where it ignites a series of nicotine receptors, which in themselves, when stimulated, ignite a cascade of neurological transmission, causing the release of large quantities of dopamine, the ubiquitous pleasure neurotransmitter in the forebrain. And simply put, the desire of a smoker to smoke comes as a consequence of falling levels of nicotine receptor stimulation and falling levels of dopamine. It's also true that smokers smoke to maintain a certain idiosyncratic personal level of nicotine. And when mixed venous levels of nicotine come close to that threshold, that's when a smoker has an urge to smoke, knowing full well that if he or she does not, there will follow some discomfort, some sense of ill ease before the development of very significant and substantial withdrawal symptoms. It's important to emphasize that today's clinicians largely have never, ever smoked. You go to a medical school class and ask how many of you have ever smoked, none of them ever have. And so as a consequence, it's very difficult for today's clinicians to appreciate just how complex and how problematic smoking cessation can be. It's been said that unless you've ever been a smoker, it's unlikely that in your life you will ever have to undertake a personal transformation that can be as challenging and as difficult as smoking cessation. Well, with that as background then, we appreciate that one of the ways that we can help individuals stop smoking is to provide them with levels of nicotine that come close to that particular nicotine threshold, therefore abating or minimizing the likelihood of the emergence of this discomfort and the symptoms of incipient withdrawal and craving. And so we have an array of nicotine replacement products. All of these products have been used poorly, generally in the past, by both clinicians and by smokers, in part because we used a now outdated fixed dose kind of paradigm. We're going to give you some help, not too much and not for too long. And so you put this patch on for a few weeks and then we'll slow down the dose and then carry on for a few. Oh, you didn't stop smoking? Well, you'd better go away and think more carefully about when you're going to make your next smoking cessation attempt and come back and see us. We don't manage hypertension that way. We don't manage dyslipidemia that way. And yet we naively had assumed that we could help individuals deal with the most addictive drug in our community by giving them a little help, but not too much because they should be able to do this on their own. And we quite happily ask patients to take 2, sometimes 3 medications for the next 25, 30, 35 years in order to manage dyslipidemia and hypertension, and got ourselves locked into this dated paradigm of fixed dose usage of these kinds of products. Well, all of these products deliver nicotine via the venous system, and they do so therefore in a way which avoids that arterial level of those arterial levels of nicotine, and irrespective of the dose of nicotine replacement therapy that a clinician uses, an individual will get far less nicotine than he or she would were they to continue smoking, and it's not being delivered via the arterial system. And so, simply put, smoking cessation can be considered as opening a doorway onto a new smoke-free future, and recognizing that for many patients, not all by any means, but many patients, that doorway needs to be held open wider and needs to be held open longer, meaning that we're prepared to titrate the dose of nicotine replacement therapy that might be needed, and perhaps to consider prolongation of that particular therapy. And so the metric that we use commonly in the Heart Institute and which we promulgate elsewhere is if you're a pack-a-day smoker, you get one 21 milligram patch plus a more rapid form of nicotine delivery. If you're a 2-pack-a-day smoker, you get 2 21-milligram patches and a more rapid form of nicotine delivery, such as the gum or the lozenge, in order to address stressful or critical issues that might occur during the day. If you're a 3-pack-a-day smoker, you can do the math. Now, the important point is, once again, to emphasize that such individuals are getting far less nicotine than they would if they were to continue to smoke. One of the zombies that continues to persist is that you can't use nicotine replacement in cardiac patients, despite the fact that we have 2 decades of evidence or more that the use of high-dose nicotine treatment, even with continued smoking, causes no adverse effects on the cardiovascular system, and there has never been any documented relationship between the use of NRT therapies and the risk of myocardial infarction, stroke, or death. And so, to emphasize the point again, visually, it's very important that we understand this fundamental concept in order that we can be more robust, more innovative, and more supportive of those who attempt to deal with smoking cessation. Well, I show this data because it's important for what is to follow. If you were to ask, what's the most effective agent to help individuals stop smoking? The evidence is quite clear. The most effective single agent is the drug varenicline. If you were to ask what's the effectiveness of the nicotine patch or another agent, bupropion, you would see that in contrast to varenicline, which triples the likelihood of successful smoking cessation, the nicotine patch by itself, or bupropion, not a drug not used as frequently anymore in smoking cessation, both effectively double the likelihood of smoking cessation. But, and this is very good news, the use of the patch in association with another more rapid form of nicotine delivery, as I have just described, almost quadruples the likelihood of smoking cessation. But I want you to note the percentage of individuals who stop smoking in these kinds of contexts. So varenicline, 33% cessation rate. Bupropion or the patch, 24-25% cessation rates. And combination nicotine replacement therapy, 36%. Important to remember those figures as we examine some of the issues which surround these devices. And here's the nub of today's discussion. These devices have transformed our ability to help individuals stop smoking. And there are a number of concepts and considerations that should underlie their use. So 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even 8, I guess, when this slide was first made, here were some of the issues that I identified in this slide that surrounded the use of the e-cigarette. First and foremost, the potential of these devices to reduce harm. Because these devices do not use combustion, their production of carcinogens is virtually eliminated. And so the idea that one can reduce the incidence of lung cancers, etc., is very real and very appropriate, simply because inhaling nicotine as a consequence of the vaporization of a solution containing nicotine is very different from a carcinogenic point of view than inhaling the products of combustion that are producing nicotine. The concern, however, was that individuals who might use these devices might not in fact stop smoking. That in fact they might continue to use these devices as well as to continue to use combustion tobacco products and therefore become what we call dual users. It was also recognized that given the addictive nature of this product, nicotine, that any industry which sought to use all of the classic marketing techniques to direct or orient these products to youth use could initiate an epidemic of nicotine addiction on a new generation of customers for an industry which was losing many of its customers precisely because they were experiencing the health consequences of the use of their products. And of course, one always had to be concerned about the degree to which the tobacco industry would seek to involve itself in this particular segment of the tobacco market. And as we will see in the next few minutes, most of those concerns have come to pass. I am still very interested in the potential for harm reduction as a consequence of the use of a device which, if appropriately regulated and containing virtually nothing but nicotine and an assortment of innocuous substances, then one can really talk thoughtfully about harm reduction. Unfortunately, the vast majority of individuals who use these devices in the general public do not stop smoking. The overwhelming number of that group become what we call dual users. And there is evidence to suggest that the combination of e-cigarettes with continued smoking actually constitutes an accentuation of risk. And that has been suggested in terms of cardiovascular disease, but also identified in other sorts of settings. Has there been an initiation of smoking amongst the adolescent population? I don't think I have to speak of that in this particular setting. We're all aware of the degree to which high schools in Ottawa are removing bathroom doors, removing USB charging devices, because there has been an explosion of use of these devices, particularly one form of device, which we'll discuss in a moment, in the young adolescent, teenage, and young adult population. And the overwhelming majority of the consumers of these products are teenagers, adolescents, and to a certain degree, young adults. Older established smokers, by and large, are not going to their store, buying these devices and using them. And so the potential for harm reduction, if it exists to the extent that was postulated, it has been lessened. Well, it's very important to understand that there are three common ingredients in all of these devices. Pardon me, three components. The mouthpiece, which may, when vacuum or suction is applied, turn on a switch which heats a device and consequently causes vaporization, which comes from a tank contained within this device. So three very simple parts, so to speak, but one very, very addicting substance as a component, nicotine. And these devices have evolved considerably over the last 4 or 5, 6 years. And it's important to understand that particularly insofar as marketing is concerned, there tend to be two particular themes. Fashion, these are trendy, sophisticated, get your vaping device to look like this, and technology. And so individuals now become either flavor chasers or vapor chasers. And if one goes into social media, you discover the kinds of advertising which talk about the voluminous amounts of vape, that you can produce, which allows teenagers to do all kinds of novel things, blowing vape through their teeth, out their nose, through their ears if they've got a ruptured eardrum, et cetera, et cetera. And those individuals are vapor chasers. Or to produce an array of flavors which are particularly attractive and are marketed very aggressively to young people, in which case one becomes a flavor chaser. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these flavors now available. As the products have evolved, it's important to realize we've come a long way from that first generation cig-alike, which was featured in the slide I showed you a few moments ago. These were disposable. They were made to look like a cigarette. The tip may have even glowed red when you sucked on it, et cetera, et cetera. They were replaced by devices that were pre-filled or with a refillable cartridge. And then we got into what are called the tanks or the mods. And tanks allow an individual to prepare his or her own vaping solution and also to jack up the voltage which is applied to this particular device by amping up the batteries, dialing up the voltage, et cetera, and thereby dramatically increasing the temperature at which this vaporization occurs. And as you will readily understand, increasing the temperature at which that vaporization occurs also causes an array of developments, if I can use that term, within the chemicals that are part of that solution. All kinds of interactions, the creation of new products, et cetera, from the hundreds of substances that may already be in that particular device. And finally, we have the fourth generation, or the pod mods. And I draw your attention once again to this description or drawing of one of these devices, but more importantly, to point out what is contained. All of the solutions typically contain three things: vegetable glycerol, propylene glycol, which you and I know as antifreeze, and nicotine. And that's the solution which is vaped to produce, heated to produce the vapor. Propylene glycol is also what's heated in devices to produce the smoke at rock and roll concerts and stage shows and theaters, etc. But there are an array of other compounds contained within the solution, and they're also identifiable within the aerosol that is produced within this particular solution. And in particular, it's important to understand that the wick and the heating device themselves contain ceramic products, contain metallic products, all of which can be problematic and are demonstrated to be problematic in terms of lung health. We all know what asbestos does to lungs. Silica is a compound not dissimilar to asbestos, and silica is given off by these particular devices as a consequence of its being an ingredient of that wicking and heating element of these devices. Well, along came this product, produced as a consequence of the ingenuity of two graduate Stanford University students who initially said they were creating a device to help people stop smoking, and to do so in a way which would be effective, would be efficient, would be palatable, which would be attractive, and which could be made fashionable, and which delivers a staggering amount of nicotine. In fact, the little pod that is heated and looks like a little USB drive contains as much nicotine as a single package of cigarettes. And it's important that you understand that, because it's important to understand that many teenagers are consuming 3, 4, or 5 of these pods a day. And what's different when one vapes as opposed to when one smokes is that when you smoke a cigarette and your nicotine needs have been sated, and there may be an hour, 35 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever, and no further smoking occurs. Individuals who vape tend to be vaping continuously throughout the day, irrespective of their setting. And because there's no smoke disappearing from the end of the cigarette, as occurs when a cigarette is idling or is being drawn upon, everything goes into the lung. Nothing is drifting off to the outside. And one of the reasons why these devices can deliver such huge quantities of nicotine is that our friends at Stanford figured out ways in which they could influence the structure of nicotine by using a nicotine salt. In the case of Juul, it's benzoic acid. And as a result, you can get levels of nicotine as a result of the acidity of that vapor that's produced that are tolerable. Smokers of cigarettes cannot tolerate more than a certain concentration of nicotine because it's very harsh, it irritates the throat, etc., etc. In fact, that's the reason why menthol is added to cigarettes and why menthol has been so problematic as an additive to cigarette products, because it desensitizes or deadens or has kind of a local anesthetic action on the sensitive tissues of the throat and the pharynx, thereby allowing an individual to inhale more nicotine. And as a consequence of this innovation, you see what happened very dramatically as a consequence of the introduction of Juul to the e-cigarette market, such that it now occupies about 78–80% of the e-cigarette market. And the mom and pop vape shops and Bill's Vaporium, etc., are going to go the way of the dinosaur because, of course, the tobacco industry is very heavily involved. Philip Morris now owns 40% of Juul. And the CEO of Juul stepped down a few months ago and was immediately replaced by an executive from Philip Morris whose whole raison d'etre throughout his career had been to ensure that tobacco industry products escaped any form of meaningful regulation. And so you understand the rationale which lays behind that particular appointment. So there's that pod cartridge, which can also be very attractive, if you will, to children. It lies around, it looks kind of neat, it can be sparkly depending upon the way in which this is manufactured. So now you also have an insecticide, nicotine, in an attractive kind of device which kids are picking up and playing with after they've been discarded or set aside by parents or others. So some disposable challenges, because now you've got an electronic waste pesticide disposal problem, which we could digress and we won't go along that direction. But this makes it possible for high school students to use these devices, as they are commonly in virtually every high school in this country, to use these devices during the day in the classroom. It's got to the point where youngsters are ill-prepared or are unwilling to use the bathrooms in high schools because there's so much vaping taking place in those situations. So kids are coming home and telling their parents, I can't urinate during the day because the bathroom is kind of this vaping cloud. And so we get calls, emails, letters every week from educators, from high school principals, from parents saying, what on earth are you going to do about this? Right? What are we going to do about this? Right? And it just underscores the challenge of seeking to introduce appropriate public policy regulation around these devices. And of course, one can conceal the use of these devices very, very easily by simply exhaling into your sweater sleeve, or you can do what many are now doing, and you can buy vapeware. And vapeware is designed so that the drawstrings of this particular hoodie are the way in which you, in your classroom, exhale the vape into the interstices of the particular clothing. So a remarkable cultural change has occurred, which means that we face very real challenges, particularly when we consider that nicotine is a gateway drug. And there is just good animal and human evidence that teenagers, given their incomplete brain development, are far more susceptible to developing nicotine addiction than would be an older adult. And that once they do, as a consequence of these addiction pathways, which are very common between and among the various drugs of addiction, once they've been established, the hard wiring, if you will, is there, which facilitates the acquisition of addiction to a whole array of other substances later in life. Well, here's what's been happening in Canada in the last several years. The incidence of vaping in public schools and in high schools, has increased dramatically. And as a consequence of that increase in vaping, both over a 30-day period and in the past 7 days, we also see a corresponding increase in smoking amongst teenagers. And so for the first time in 35 years, we have seen an increase in rates of adolescent smoking. And we celebrated the fact that we had been able to drive down adolescent and youth smoking over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. And now a reversal is underway as a consequence of the aggressive marketing, of the introduction of these particular devices. And make no mistake, these devices have been very, very heavily advertised to young people. And all one has to do is to go onto social media and see the kind of advertising, and they replicate all of the worst practices of the tobacco industry of 3 decades ago. And why should we be surprised? Because the tobacco industry is behind these substances. What we do know is that the principal reasons why both youngsters and younger adults smoke is because they like the vapor and they like the smell. And these flavors are there precisely to ensure that that adolescent or young adult market has products that they can buy. Did I mention that these products are totally unregulated in Canada? In contrast to the situation in the European Union, in a variety of other countries, Australia banned these devices outright. The city of New York moving to ban these devices outright. The city of San Francisco, the home, if you will, given its proximity to Stanford, of Juul, banning the sale of these devices, expelling, as a result, indirectly, the Juul headquarters, which were contained within the city of San Francisco. And yet our nice, kind, gentle Canadian government has still not seen fit, despite the recommendations provided years ago, to regulate these devices in a meaningful way. Well, the consequences of the epidemic of youth vaping were borne out this past summer when we saw this explosion of serious acute lung injuries and substantial numbers of otherwise unpredicted deaths occurring from individuals who vaped. And it is important to acknowledge that, yes, the majority of the cases seem to reflect the degree to which youngsters using those modified devices or others specifically sold to allow vaping of marijuana were vaping marijuana that was cut with vitamin E acetate, a fatty substance which is used to up the profits of the drug dealers and reduce the concentration of marijuana as a consequence in the product which was sold. But it's also very important to understand that a significant proportion of the individuals who had these lung injuries reported that they were vaping nicotine-only products. And that's a reality that cannot be ignored. Well, what are the consequences of using e-devices and inhaling the solutions which are produced? And our colleagues in respiratory toxicology have now begun only recently to examine the consequences of the use of these devices. And what they are finding is quite disturbing. And it can be summarized in this way. While it's reasonable to assume that we reduce the neoplastic burden or the potential for neoplastic disease as a consequence of vaping nicotine, it's also clear that there are emerging changes in lung function which may presage a whole new category of lung diseases, interstitial lung diseases, which are incredibly rare. P.S. Lung cancer was incredibly rare in the 1930s. And it was only after 2 or 3 decades of using combustion cigarettes that we had the epidemic that continues of lung cancer. Lung cancer now the leading form of cancer death amongst Canadian women, an entirely preventable epidemic. And so one has to ask reasonably, are we about to embark upon a journey in which it will take 2 or 3 decades before the concerns that are now being expressed are manifest in an epidemic of other forms of fatal lung disease with the morbidity, etc., that will follow. And it's also important to understand that these hundreds of flavored chemicals that are used are categorized in the toxicology industry, as GRAS, generally regarded as safe for either topical application, let's say coconut and sunscreen, or for ingestion, let's say coconut flavors to eat. None of these products have ever been tested to see what the consequences of their inhalation might be. And we already know that certain fats, certain oils, if inhaled, produce catastrophic issues in terms of lung tissue and lung function. And there are a whole array of lung toxicants in e-cigarettes: vegetable glycerine, propylene glycol, particularly nicotine. But let's talk about what happens when individuals inhale popcorn flavoring. And in the popcorn industry, there's a phenomenon known as popcorn lung, bronchiolitis obliterans, which has been recognized as individuals who inhale the flavoring agents that are part and parcel of that industry. And of course, if you're inhaling popcorn flavored vaping juice, you're getting exactly the same kind of product. We've talked about some of the metallic elements. The wicks themselves contain cotton fibers, et cetera, and there are silica. And we've already talked about the potential issues that could surround silica. And so our respiratory toxicology colleagues, looking at these devices, want to emphasize that there's no long-term safety data, and saying with certainty that these e-cigarettes are safer is now virtually impossible. And these devices will likely have pulmonary toxicity with even short-term use. And in the same article, the authors point out that it's important that pediatricians in particular begin to call out for effective regulation of these products, particularly insofar as flavor is concerned. We also know, and an earlier slide indicated this, that these devices cause very significant and substantial changes to the immune mechanisms which are present in the lung and so important for lung defense. And there are characteristic findings which have occurred in those individuals who've had this acute lung injury, which is reflective of chemical burns, if you will, and highly inflammatory changes in those particular lungs. The index case in Canada, which was reported just a few weeks ago in the CMAJ and occurred in London, Ontario, underscored the fact that clinicians generally are unaware of the likelihood of these devices to produce A, acute lung injuries, but B, as respirologists are now saying, failing to appreciate that individuals who have underlying lung disease and who do not present with acute exacerbations are now presenting more frequently in emergency rooms and elsewhere with changes of other forms of lung disease. And all of which, as the authors pointed out, call for tighter regulation. And in Matthew Stanbrook editorializing in the CMAJ on that point points out that we need restrictions on advertising, the same as those for tobacco products, and effective regulation, including a ban on flavorings. And let's hope, he opined, it's not too late for Canada's government to learn. Well, you may be more interested, understandably, in what are the cardiovascular consequences of the use of these devices. And we understand that all of the classic mechanisms which can contribute to the development of atherosclerosis and its ultimate manifestations are at play in terms of e-cigarette aerosols. And the evidence is now burgeoning and occurring with ever-increasing frequency of the implications of the use of these devices, reflecting the fact that these have only been seen to be problematic for at least, for the last decade, and realistically the last 4 or 5 years. And when you look at the use of these aerosols in terms of influencing vascular function, we see that there are very significant changes that occur as a consequence in terms of flow-mediated dilatation, or reflecting arterial stiffness, et cetera, et cetera. And what we see is that when we look at other cardiovascular risk factors and their influence on vascular function, we see that e-cigarettes are almost the same as conventional cigarettes in producing some of those vascular changes. And in the words of these authors, this data, should be viewed as a harbinger of the potential effects on humans, and that the use of these devices as a harm reduction device is questionable, and that we need to be much more vigilant in monitoring the cardiovascular and respiratory consequences amongst adolescents and young adults. Using some of the more sophisticated imaging techniques, we also see that there is evidence of significant endothelial dysfunction and significant microvascular function. So that data is there and is accumulating, and I would suggest there's a very opportune moment for imaging researchers to begin to examine what the consequences of the use of these devices might be. We also know, and this is that these devices increase platelet aggregability and therefore contribute to thrombogenesis. So we have vascular dysfunction, we have increased thrombogenicity, and all of us understand what the implications may be. And by the way, I'm talking about pure e-cigarette juice. Right? These are distinct from the presence of nicotine. Well, do these devices in fact help individuals stop smoking? And this is somewhat dated data, in that it appeared before a seminal article in the New England Journal, but there's limited evidence that e-cigarettes may be effective, and that there's limited evidence to suggest that they're any more effective than any of the other devices we might use. Many of you may know we just had our annual Ottawa conference, and in order to address this issue, we invited arguably the leading international researchers, both from a clinical and basic science perspective, Dr. Hayden McRobbie, who was the senior author of the article I'm going to show you, which appeared in the New England Journal, and Dr. Stan Glantz, who has published widely about the risks and the harms that might be associated with the use of e-cigarettes, and as a consequence has become the focus of a rather concerted campaign by the e-cigarette industry. But here's this data from the New England Journal that was part of Hayden's paper. And what you see, to cut to the chase, is that the likelihood of stopping smoking with e-cigarettes was about 18%. Recall the data that I showed you earlier about the use of conventional products to assist with smoking cessation, in which we had percentages in the 34, 35, 36 level. And in this particular study, those using nicotine replacement, conventional nicotine replacement, had about half that rate of cessation. What's also interesting to note, however, is that if you look at the end of that study, the individuals who were still using e-cigarettes were substantially higher than the proportion of individuals who were still using nicotine replacement therapy. And we know that the longer an individual uses e-cigarette devices, the likelihood of them reverting to smoking continues. And it's also important to point out that these were controlled clinical trials. And rates of smoking cessation in controlled clinical trials always tend to be markedly higher than the incidental rates of smoking cessation, which may occur in a free grazing population of smokers. And as we see from from this data that follows, if we look at the forest plot, we see that all of the studies that have looked at the impact of e-devices on smoking cessation in the general public, not part of clinical trials, show that the likelihood of smoking cessation is actually less once an individual begins to use e-devices. It's also been suggested in this controversial, well, not all that controversial article, but which was an analysis of the impact of e-devices on helping people to stop smoking, and comparing it with the likelihood of these devices, aggressively marketed, increasing rates of nicotine addiction, that in a conservative estimate suggests that 80 kids will start smoking for every adult that quits smoking using an e-cigarette device. And those who've examined this article say that that figure is probably worse as a consequence of the fact that the statistical analysis used the most optimistic quitting estimate, and the data predates the introduction of Juul. And Juul has changed the marketplace and indeed the whole landscape of the use of these particular devices. So what might be a clinician's wish list? Someone who was working in smoking cessation and said, gee, it would be nice if we had a harm reduction technique or also a device which we might be able to use to help people actually stop smoking. And the evidence, that wish list would include these particular elements. But first and foremost, we would not want these products to cause harm. And I think what we are seeing now is a conflict, as we'll examine in a moment, between two kinds of principles. When you actually talk to clinicians, and this is sort of a convenient sample of speaking to people at various settings that I've been speaking at, there are a whole array of concerns amongst clinicians that mean that they have no interest in talking about these devices as harm reduction techniques or as smoking cessation aids because they see it's a Wild West show. The oxycodone of smoking cessation. These are perspectives which are going to be very difficult. This genie has escaped the bottle. And ironically, as a consequence of the failure of the federal government to introduce meaningful, thoughtful regulation, our ability to be able to use these devices is now virtually non-existent in the current setting. Ironically, when we applied for permission to do a study using these particular devices, Health Canada said, well, we can't, you can't, these are unregulated devices. How are you going to get an ethics committee to give you approval? If, in fact, we did get an ethics committee approval, these are unregulated devices. So the very organization which has failed to regulate these devices now uses that reality as a means as to why we cannot conduct studies in that area. Nonetheless, perspectives are evolving, and we see this perspective or opinion of the chief medical officers of health from across Canada. And I think the words of the British Columbia Minister of Health some weeks ago, vaping has shifted from being a smoking cessation tool for adults to an addiction trap for youth. And at the moment, as a consequence of federal failure to regulate, we have a hodgepodge of intended or actual regulations across the country. There is no regulation in Canada of the nicotine content of these devices, in contrast to the United Kingdom and other communities within the European area. There is very limited, meaningless regulation of advertising. Other provinces are moving to fill that void. British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island moving quickly and perhaps more robustly in the last few weeks. British Columbia are going to be raising the prices, regulating the nicotine content. Nova Scotia and PEI doing what everyone should be doing, and that's banning the flavoring substances in these particular devices.
Are you serious? Does anyone call the cops on you guys here today?
It's dangerous. You shouldn't be here.
So we have vanilla mist, double chocolate dream, and then we also have butterscotch bliss, blue raspberry, orange twist, and cotton candy yum.
Blue raspberry.
Blue one, blue raspberry, yeah. Cotton candy yum?
I like that.
Is that good ice cream? So this is organic, farm fresh ice cream, also infused with 100% organic nicotine. Nicotine.
Ice creams normally have nicotine?
There's 28 milligrams in every cone or cup.
Are you joking?
Are you serious? Yep.
Why are we going to use nicotine? Sorry, it's
There is nicotine in the ice cream. This
Why
is,
would you give that to kids? Is it good for kids?
like, I'm not a doctor, so I can't say for sure. Do you want a blue raspberry?
I don't want any of this.
No.
How dare you guys?
I can't take it. It's not like we're giving cigarettes away.
You're putting nicotine in ice cream. Just because you dress it up in a flavor doesn't make it any better.
Well, an intriguing public service announcement, but as intriguing as the message itself is the origin. A major Canadian advertising agency, unknown to anyone in the health community, so concerned about the consequences of the activities of their colleagues in fomenting this epidemic, produced this ad, high-quality ad, and knocked on the door of the Heart and Stroke Foundation and the Lung Association and said, "This is yours, use it as you want." So reflective, if you will, of increasing public sentiment around these devices. And we need to push the reset button. We need to ensure that we have appropriate regulation of these devices, and the elements of that regulation of potential regulatory action are found on this particular slide. And this just underscores that important role that we as clinicians can play as being advocates in terms of trying to jar an indifferent and inertial federal government to take action against these particular issues. There is a classic principle in public health practice called the precautionary principle, which says that if there is reasonable evidence to suggest that a product, a process, a practice is going to produce harmful consequences, we should regulate, eliminate, control that particular product. There is also a principle, harm reduction principle, which says in certain circumstances we may be able to mitigate the impact of various behaviors by substituting other processes and dramatically reducing harm. I believe strongly in harm reduction. I think that the use of methadone and Suboxone in terms of opioid addiction makes sense. I do not believe that one should sell chocolate-flavored methadone or bubblegum-flavored Suboxone in convenience stores across the country. And no responsible practitioner using harm reduction approaches to manage opioid dependence would argue for that approach either, I would argue. But unfortunately, there are those within the federal government apparatus and those within our whole community who have succumbed to the siren song of harm reduction, a song which emanates from Public Health England, who say, without any basis whatsoever, that the use of these devices are 95% safer than smoking. And that's a chorus that has been repeated around the world, but only in the United Kingdom has that chorus been actually acted upon, with the exception of Canada, where we have a complete void of regulation. Even in the United Kingdom, there are some meaningful regulations of these devices. So we have a challenge captured in this document from the Heart and Stroke Foundation. We know that the public is strongly behind regulating these products. We know that every provincial and territorial government has asked the federal government a year or more ago to align the regulation of these devices to make them similar to the regulation and control of tobacco products, and to ensure that we do not have this hodgepodge, this patchwork quilt of regulations across the country. All of which underscores the central truth of Rudolf Virchow, who so many years ago said, there are two causes of disease. One is pathological, the other is political. And the degree to which we can enhance intelligent, sensitive, insightful, thoughtful, and forceful public regulation of these devices will be the degree to which we can begin to catch up and address the problem that has been unleashed. And I suppose the last zombie concept is that the tobacco issue has been addressed. Let's move on. We got smoking rates down. 47,000 Canadians die 10 years earlier than they would ordinarily do so each year as a consequence of our failure to recognize this industry. And if these technologies have been disruptive, they've been disruptive in many ways. And one of the more important ways in which they've been disruptive is that they've taken our eye off the ball. Because now we're scurrying around to deal with the e-cigarette issue, and not moving purposefully and in a focused and thoughtful way to move to that less than 5 by 35 end game strategy. This is an industry which is unregulated. It is alone in terms of being unregulated. And it is only unregulated because of the indifference of public policy leaders and because of the reptilian stealth, to repeat that phrase, of the tobacco industry. This is the single most powerful preventive intervention that we can deliver. It is a challenge. And I think it's important for us to understand that it's no longer important to ask, have you used any form of tobacco in the past 7 days? Have you used any form of tobacco in the past 6 months? It's also now important to ask, are you using any vaping devices? What kind of vaping device are you using, and how often are you using that vaping device? Because the use of these products undoubtedly will result in an accentuation or initiation of cardiovascular issues. I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your understanding that I can sometimes be tediously boring when I start to talk about these particular issues. I am aware that there are other things in life besides tobacco, but I would welcome your comments, your criticisms, and your questions in the time that remains. Thank you very much.